Okay, welcome everyone. I know we're gonna have a few more joining us. We're starting a little bit before official Berkeley time, so thank you for coming early. But we'll get going here in a few minutes. I just wanted to take just a real quick minute though to introduce our speaker today, a very special speaker. We're very happy to have Alvy join us. He actually lives just south of campus, so it's very convenient. I first ran across him remotely, and ever since then until today, it was always remotely, but he's given a lot of talks online and Computer History Museum most recently and so forth that I watched. So Alvy's had a extremely interesting career in life, and he'll tell us about a lot of that today. I think probably what might have caught your attention as it did mine was the fact that he's a co-founder of Pixar. So everybody knows Pixar, and you know, how often is it that you get to meet a co-founder, right? There's not that many of you. Two, exactly. You and Ed, I guess, right? Yeah. So, but before that, you know, he was at LucasFilms, and that's actually, he'll probably tell us that and how it was spun out and created Pixar. He was the first director of computer graphics at LucasFilms, and first graphics fellow at Microsoft, and so he's been a few different places over his career. He's received some Academy Awards, so that's also very. Oh, do we need to? Do we need to? This computer thing? Oh, okay, sorry, no problem. Anyway, so he has Academy Awards, but he's going to tell us about his path through, I think, all the computer graphics, starting at the very beginning of this, well, science initially, and then industry as it developed. He's you know, he actually taught briefly here, I think, at Berkeley 1 year or something a while back.
Just
one term, okay. But his wife is a professor here, so he has a lot of Berkeley ties. Although he did get his degree from some junior college on the other side of the bay.
You know that.
Literally junior college, right? It's Leland Stanford Junior College, right? That's the joke. But anyway, so we're very happy to have Alvy here today. He's got a little present, I think, for some of you, as long as the presents you know last. I'll hand those out later. But thank you again for coming on up here, and welcome our speaker today, Alvy Smith.
Well, hello everybody. Happy to be here. You can probably tell I'm selling a book, right? I started this book 10 years ago, probably 11 years ago, but at this point, kind of based on the notion that nobody seemed to know what a pixel was. You know, we're swimming in an ocean of them. I figure there must be about a zettapixel out there by now, which is a 1 with 21 zeros after it. And I ask people what a pixel is, and I get all kinds of screwy answers. I mean, the most common one is this. Wait a minute. This. Hello? Not advancing. There we go. That picture. So you go out to Google and images and look up the word pixel, you get pictures like this. So the first thing I want to say is pixels have never been little squares ever. This picture right here is completely false. These are not pixels. They never have been. Get that out of your mind. One of the curious things to me is why has this become fixed in people's minds as what computer pictures should look like? They don't. I've got a couple of reasons. I think that this is what has sunk in, is that people have long thought that computers were rigid, linear, mathematical, arithmetical, couldn't possibly do anything lovely. So somehow little squares stacked up seem to be appropriate thing that a computer could do. Well, I hope you now know a computer is the most malleable tool ever invented by humankind. It is unlimited what it can do, beyond belief what it can do. It can certainly do beautiful images. Nothing as stupid looking as this. Even in the old days, as I'll show you. Another reason, and this may be the main culprit, is the zoom. Every app has a zoom feature. I'll come back to that in a little bit, but When you zoom in and you see squares, that's a fake, that's a lie. Well, I'll show you in a minute. All right. Who am I talking to, by the way? Are we engineers here? Double E's, mostly, is that right? I mean, everybody knows Fourier theory, right? And everybody knows the sampling theorem, right? Okay, I'm going to give it to you in kind of a simple-minded form because I wrote this for lay people. I don't even use the word sine wave. I just call it a wave, for example. So I'm going to go over this part really fast. This is Fourier. Everything I'm going to talk about starts with him. This is a really handsome picture of the guy who's actually kind of fat. And as we all know, his idea was doing this, that you can add up waves that look like this at different frequencies and different amplitudes and get any one-dimensional signal. Well, real world one-dimensional, you can always come up with mathematical screwball functions that you can't do by adding up Fourier waves. But for the real world stuff like audio, you can add them together and get, here's the word yes, for example, in frequency speak. In frequencies, the hiss of the S at the end of the yes is 5 frequencies out to the right there. But he went further than that. He said, okay, if you extrude those sine waves out from the plane, just pull them out towards you, you get corrugations. And the cross section of a corrugation is a one-dimensional sine wave. So these are 2D Fourier waves. And this is what you get if you look down on top of them. Different frequencies. You add these together, same idea. You add these together, you get pictures. For example, a picture of your kid. This happens to be my kid a long time ago, by the way. Back when it was still called Revenge of the Jedi. Okay. And or this. This is a hagiographic picture of Napoleon. Now, how many of you know the story of Fourier? Do you know anything about him? Isn't that kind of weird? I didn't either. I grew up, I was a double E. I didn't know. Probably everybody in high tech uses Fourier every day. And yet when I ask people about, they don't know who he was. So I did a little research. The reason this book took 10 years is because every time I stopped to write down the history, it took me a year to figure it out and write it down. Take the myths away and put the real facts in place. So really quickly, Fourier was a French revolutionary. In the French Revolution, he almost got his head cut off, guillotined off, because he became a foul of Robespierre. Lucky for us and him, Robespierre lost his head to the guillotine first, saving our guy by 10 days. All right, so the next thing that happened was his new buddy, Napoleon Bonaparte, took him as a savant to Egypt. Now, Napoleon was going there on a military exercise, but he brought along these savants to do, to basically get the science of Egyptology started. And it was the crew that found the Rosetta Stone, for example. And in fact, Fourier later in his life mentored Champignon, who cracked the hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone. On and on. So the story is really good. He came up with the greenhouse effect about 1800. That's Fourier. He celebrated one of the earliest well-known female mathematicians, Sophie Germain, and so forth. So he's a great story, but I'm not going to spend too much time on him since you already know all about him. Well, his theory, anyhow. Now the sampling theorem is based on Fourier. It's the reason I have to start with Fourier. And I grew up, well, like I said, double E. I was taught that Claude Shannon. Actually, I was taught that Nyquist did it. Harry Nyquist did it. Back before, I'm really old, so there wasn't even, computers didn't exist when I was born. So I've seen the whole damn thing unwind. And one of the early days was we got taught in double E, we got taught that Harry Nyquist came up with the sampling theorem. And then later, after I went to graduate school at Stanford, the world started becoming digital. It suddenly became Claude Shannon that did the sampling theorem. That's probably your version. Anybody heard otherwise? Well, it turns out every country has a candidate for who invented the sampling theorem. And so I started another year down the drains. I started sorting through the history of the sampling theorem, who did it first. And my opinion, backed up with a lot of fact, is that this guy did it first. His name is Vladimir Kotelnikov. He was a Russian. He came up with the sampling theorem with all the nuance of the theorem, including bandpass and low pass. You guys know what that means. In 1933, in this paper. I can't read Russian, but I can read the math. And the math is exactly as I use the sampling theorem today. By the way, 33 is 15 years before Claude Shannon. So Claude Shannon just wasn't first. In fact, Claude Shannon never even said he did it. This is the amazing thing. But you know, during the Cold War, we're not going to give a Russian commie credit for something as important as the sampling theorem. Right. The last picture I have of Kotelnikov is, by the way, the picture on the left is he was about 24 when he proved the sampling theorem. And the picture on the right is he's standing in the Kremlin as an old man in about 2003, the 70th anniversary of his paper, one at the top. I edited this picture because I couldn't stand looking at Vladimir Putin, who's edited out in that blank space. He's standing next to Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin being knighted, or whatever the equivalent in Russia is, chevalier or cavalier or whatever they, you know, very high award for. The Russian version of the history is that Kotelnikov proved it first, and I think they're right. So I'm going to bore you. Oh, I just want you to remember that shape right there. You all know it's the sink function. I don't say that. I think I say it once in my book. I call it a spreader, and you're going to see why in a moment. All right, in one dimension, look, I feel silly kind of saying this to you, but I just want you to see how simple this is, as you already know. But you have a one-dimensional audio signal, for example, like this. Time going to the right on the axis, straight line is the zero loudness line. Kotelnikov says if you place points along that curve, equally spaced points at a certain rate, you can throw away everything between. What? And not lose anything. You can do what? You can throw away an infinity of points between the sample points, as we call them, and not lose anything. Yeah, that's what the sampling theorem says. It's kind of awesome. You apparently don't lose any. You don't lose anything, but it seems like you're apparently throwing away an infinity. So what gives here? Well, the other half. So, you know, the two-dimensional version is this, you can think of this as a cross section through the two dimensionals. An image is, you can think of it as a rumpled cloth, where the heights of the rumples in the cloth are the brightnesses and the darknesses of the image. And we have a bed of nails that does the sampling instead of a comb. So the magic rate that you have to sample at to make this thing true is twice the highest Fourier frequency, slightly greater actually, which I claim in this case is the wave I'm showing there, because there's nothing in the original signal that wiggles any faster. Okay. All right. Now the other half of the theorem says, how do you take the samples that you took 10 years ago in China and get back the original sound that those things represent? Well, remember that shape? Take the spreader, and we're going to spread each of those samples. Of course, this thing is infinite in both directions, infinitely wide. We can't really use it in the real world. Always, we're engineers. We know you have to be realistic. So we replace it with a good approximation, and this is a really good one. It's got the hump, it's got negative lobes, but it's a finite width. We can actually work with this in the real world. You put down a copy of the spreader at each sample. You spread each sample. Think of there being a knob. Put down the spreader at a sample and adjust its height so it's the same height as the sample. And then you add up the results. And that smooth curve there is the original signal. So within the, you know, we did narrow the width of the spreader function from infinite width to finite width. So there's a slight error, but it's not much. Now, same thing works for pictures. This is what the spreader looks like. A good spreader looks like in 2 dimensions for pictures. If you drop a guillotine right through that little hillock, you can see that the cross section is that 1-dimensional spreader function. And this is a picture of a 2-dimensional sample being spread by that little hillock spreader function. All right. Yes.
How do you define it? So the spreader function, of course, clearly has parameters.
Yes.
So how do you pick that?
It has to do with highest frequency, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. It has to. You have to sample it twice the highest frequency. That's the sampling theorem. Now, there's a lot of consequences of that fact, which we can get to if you want to. But one thing I want to point out right now is I've never mentioned a little square once. There are no little squares. That sample there, we have a name for that sample. It's called a pixel. A pixel is a sample at a point of an image. It has 0 dimensions. You can't see a pixel. And it's certainly not a little square. And you all know this. I mean, you're just like me. You probably have several billion pixels you carry around your cell phone right now, and you can't see any of them. Right? They're in there. But you can't see them. If you want to see them, tap on the file name or whatever, and suddenly the image gets reconstructed using the sampling theorem from the pixels that are stored. And those little glowy spots across the face of your cell phone or any display, this display, for example, this display, are those little reconstruction filters, those spreaders. And I call them display elements. They have width, they're analog for one thing. They have width, they overlap, and you add them up together and you get the original picture back. But really common mistake in the world today is to confuse display elements, as I call them, with pixels. Display elements they're completely different kinds. It's a category mistake to confuse those two things. Pixels are completely digital, they're discrete, they exist at a point. Display elements, these little glowy things, shape, they overlap, they're soft. You drive them digitally, but their output is analog, and you get your original picture back. That's the magic that drives the modern media world. All right, back to the point about zoom being the culprit. I've drawn a picture here in Photoshop of 14 pixels. Actually, they're spread pixels because you can see them if you squint. If I want to get a close-up of that, what do? Well, you zoom in by, say, a factor of 100, and you get that kind of picture. But zoom is just a dirty trick. Basically, you replace each pixel with a square array of pixels of, in this case, 100 by 100, if I'm zooming by a factor of 100. Guess what it looks like? It looks like a little square. What a surprise. But if you do it right, using image size in Photoshop, whoops, you get that. You're looking down those little mountains from the top. They're soft, they're overlap, and they're not little squares. I think that's where this notion of square pixels comes from. So many people zoom so many pictures that they become convinced that that's what, but down at the bottom, it must be little squares. Not so. All right, I'm going to make a leap now to so that's kind of 2 fundamental technologies of our modern world. The third is computers. Again, talking to the choir here, I'm sure, as everybody knows that Alan Turing invented computation. How many of you know that he invented store program computers? It's people try to give hardware engineers that credit, but actually the original paper, 1936, that Alan Turing wrote, he describes a stored program computer with memory, with data, with programming, everything that we use in the modern world with computers. He defined it in 1936. It's one of the few cases where there is one shining hero at the top. Now, you say, well, there's Ada Lovelace, there's Babbage, there's Leibniz. Yes, those guys all kind of had the idea, but he nailed it. He just nailed it, including all the surprising aspects of computation, namely, it's captured by the halting problem, which basically says even though it's completely deterministic in the small, you can't know in advance what's going to happen. That's profound. The other guy that gets a lot of credit from the early days is this guy. And I love this picture. That's Johnny von Neumann. He's sitting ass backwards on a mule at the edge of the Grand Canyon, wearing a business suit, the only guy with a business suit and no hat. He was a party animal, but he was really smart. He was one of the smartest guys. He knew exactly what Turing had done. So he was able to, and both of these guys immediately knew that computation was incredibly slow as a software idea, as a mathematical and a paper idea. It had to go fast to be useful. And everybody knows in this crowd, especially, that if you want software to go fast, you implement it in hardware. And they both rushed off to implement computation in hardware. Alan Turing failed. He tried, but he failed. He had a product called, in fact, I don't really mean for you to read every block on this diagram. I just want you to see how complex it is. So one of my ideas in this book is people try to simplify these really nasty technical histories by having a narrative, a simple narrative of a shining hero from which everything evolves. It never works that way. It just doesn't work like that. You get people that fight with each other and stab each other in the back and steal ideas, and there's just borrow ideas to be benign about it. So here's a brief history of computers, kind of taking it into account that you have to see how it all works together. You can't just say this guy started it all. And sure enough, Alan Turing and Johnny von Neumann are at the top, but really what's at the top is that paper, 1936 paper on computable numbers by Alan Turing that established the whole thing. Down on this row right here are the first computers. And by that I mean hardware realizations, electronic stored program computers. That's my definition of a computer. A fast calculator is not a computer. ENIAC wasn't a computer because it wasn't stored program. Colossus in Britain wasn't a computer because it wasn't a stored program computer. These are really the first computers. And you can see how all these guys, you follow the lines around, they all had influence on one another at the time. I want to pick out just two of these, Baby and Whirlwind. Baby is, I believe, with one contender, the first computer. And I went to visit Baby for this book. Baby, believe it or not, the first computer was named Baby. In Manchester, England. This is Baby. This is actually the display, Baby's display. And when I went to visit, this was on the screen. And the word Pixar was scrolling to the right. So, much to my surprise, the first computer, meaning the hardware realization, first computer had pixels and it could animate. You'd think I already knew that, right? I mean, this is my field. No, I was amazed. So I went out to find the first pixels, and here they were. All right. Here's the actual first pixels, first display. They're spread pixels, obviously. The first display, the engineer, Tom Kilburn, who built Baby, there were two engineers that built Baby, and one of them, Tom Kilburn, actually took this picture. And so that's the first digital image right there. I call it first light. And so that's in Manchester, England, 1947. I was born in 43, by the way. So I was already, 4 years old by this time. 5 years old. I started poking around and saying, well, who else had pictures going at this time? This is going to be a history of digital light, as I call it. I found this game, first game that I have an actual record of, from 1951 in Manchester, England also. It's interactive. It's the game of checkers. Okay. And then I kept looking, and in Cambridge, England, I found the second or third game. There's a little controversy in there. Tic-tac-toe. Again, it's interactive. Now, I had my version. I thought so the history I kind of grew up with, and nobody really done a good job of writing it, was computer graphics began sort of in 1962 with this guy Ivan Sutherland and MIT and Sketchpad. This is at least a decade before that, and it's interactive and it's computer graphics. I mean, there's a model in the computer that's being rendered on the screen, which is what I mean by computer graphics. What gives here? Why is the story not tied together? And then so the other computer I want to spend a little time on is Whirlwind. I had a delightful day in the Whirlwind archives in Bedford, Mass. MITRE Corporation, a secret place. I had one day at this archives, and they were wonderful. It was a wonderful day. I found all these firsts. The first this, first that. I think that's the first 3D picture. No perspective, but it's 3D. The first animation is down the lower right, 1951. I showed you Pixar animating. So Baby could have had the first animation, but I found no record that anybody had done so. In the early days of computers, it was a sin to use computers to make pictures. They were for computing H-bombs or A-bombs or something like that. It was a misuse of a very expensive tool to do something flighty like make a picture. And one old engineer told me he wouldn't even told me if he did. So at Whirlwind, that wasn't the case. This is like 2 or 3 years later after Baby, and there I started to get the idea, wait a minute, making pictures is really going to be what this is all about. Okay, I'll make another leap here. Another use of the sampling. I thought this was going to be another use of the sampling theorem. What I really want to get to is what I use as an armature in my book is the history of movies, animated movies, like Pixar. And I thought that if you think about a movie, the movie is a sample in time, or the frame is what we call the sample. So I thought, okay, I'll sit down and I'll explain how movies work using the sampling theorem. It doesn't work that way, but let's just talk about it for a moment. The idea is you take samples at a fast enough frequency, and then you spread them, whatever that means, to spread a frame, and then you add up the results and you get the continuous flow that those samples represent. That's what the sampling theorem says, right? Well, nobody ever did that. Nobody ever built that machine. I think it's to be done. There's nothing that says it shouldn't work. In other words, the idea is we take the samples, frames, and we reconstruct the time flow of images outside the eye. And then it's presented to the eye like the normal world comes in every day. The brain already knows what to do with a continual flow of images. But that's not how movies work. Actual movies shutter between frames. So a frame is flashed on the retina, then the blackness between that frame and the next one is flashed on the retina, and then the frame is hit again twice. And somehow the brain figures out from that information, it does the reconstruction. Somehow the brain does a reconstruction from these samples. It was done completely ad hoc with no idea that the sampling theorem even existed. And I think that's just sitting out there to be done. What it means to spread a frame is you have the light come up until it reaches maximum intensity, and you have the light go down. That spreads it in time. And then you have the preceding frame and the succeeding frame coming up in staggered form, like I've tried to show across the bottom here. You add up the results. There's no reason we couldn't do that today. All right. Who invented the movies? I get 3 answers. You might want to take a stab at it. Who do you think of it? I thought it was the Edisons when I grew up. Yeah. Another name I often get is Edward Muybridge. And a third, if you're French, it's the Lumiere brothers. No question about it, it's these French guys. Well, it turns out to be none of those. Again, it's just, I'm surprised at how the myths about these guys get started and they just don't go away. I looked very closely into Edward Muybridge to see what he did. Famously, he photographs Tycoon Stanford, the guy that started the school, was into racehorses, and he hired this guy Muybridge to photograph his racehorse to prove that all four hooves of a racehorse were off the ground at the same time. And he made that photograph, and Stanford won a bet, I think. And the myth is that then movies developed from that process. So I looked into it. No, they didn't. What Muybridge did was he took successive photographs of the running horse, and he had an artist render those photographs in India ink onto the edges of the disc as shown here. And if you'll notice, they're elongated horizontally because his projection system had a defect that he had to accommodate for. So I say, wait a minute, a system that doesn't use photographs, it only lasts a second long if you're lucky, isn't the precursor. That's not the movies. That's not the movies. So here, before I get to more on that, let me just show you a picture of Muybridge. He's this guy, and that's Stanford. So Stanford was the tycoon that gave him the opportunity to develop this system. The reason I have him in my book is because he's such a damn good story. He wasn't the inventor of movies by any means, but you could call him the Johnny Appleseed because he went out and he told everybody, in particular Edison, about this idea that moving things could be a form of entertainment. And he also shot a guy. He murdered a guy here in Napa Valley it was his wife's lover. And he got off, even though the judge said you can't do that. He had a gun, he took it and shot the guy he intended to shoot him, but they let him off anyhow because he was defending his honor. Okay. All right. He's a good story, but he didn't do it. All right, here's Edison and what I call his Napoleon pose. So Muybridge got Edison excited about maybe there's some entertainment possibilities here. And Edison sketched, which is the way you did a patent in those days. You submitted a sketch of a patent you would probably take out later. And his labs had already invented the phonograph, which had sound recorded in a spiral around a cylinder. So Edison's sketch showed a tiny strip of images wound around a cylinder. And then you would look at, as the cylinder rotated, you'd look at this strip of images through a magnifying glass. That was his idea for a movie. Totally unworkable. But he handed that idea off to the guy on the right. Now here's the guy that probably did the movies and nobody's heard of him. His name is William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. He built Edison's camera for him. Of course, Edison took all the credit, all the patents, and all the money, and gave this guy zero credit. This guy also, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, also invented the 35mm format that was the standard for the last century, where each frame has 4 percs per frame. It's a really nasty process. It doesn't matter anymore how nasty that process is. Film doesn't exist anymore. We don't need that stuff. But still, he set the standard there. Does anybody know that? I didn't. It's my business. I didn't know this. And finally, he realized that Edison was never going to give him credit for anything. So he went on and joined another company which built a projector. Edison wouldn't build a projector because it would cannibalize his peep show business. People realized in 1895, that was the year of the projector, a lot of people suddenly invented the movie projector. And we had complete movie systems, camera, film, projectors starting in 1895. Just to fix on time.
About 15 minutes.
What?
15, 20 minutes.
Left that I can
Yeah.
talk? Okay. I should start rolling it down here. Okay, if we're going to get any interaction here. Okay, all right. Well, I'm not going to make it to Pixar at this rate. I hope you're learning a lot anyhow. So here's my summary of the movie history of the world. It's Edison and Muybridge and the Lumiere brothers are all in here. Yes, they all serve parts, mostly as businessmen. The inventors are on this row here. The guys actually did the work. And just to show you how the Edison doesn't come across as a cool guy at all. If you study the history, he comes across as a tyrant who stole the credit from all his inventors. Like suddenly Edison figured out that he needed a projector if he's going to compete with all these other outfits. So, but this guy his guy, William Kennedy Lord Dixon, had left by then and set up Biography. So Edison Company bought the projector that these two guys had invented, Jenkins and Armand, and by contract took their names off, never to be used again. Put Edison's name on instead, and that became the Edison system. The camera and the projector, Edison had nothing to do with either one of them. But he had the patents, and he made all the money, and he just didn't give credit to anybody. That's why it was so hard to write this history. It turns out on the French side, it's just as nasty. I was the curator of the Library of Congress, helped me out tremendously in understanding all this in America. On the French side, it was the curator of the Cinémathèque Française in Paris who helped me out. He says, Alvy, it's just as nasty here. The Lumiere brothers hated each other. They stabbed each other in the back. They denied credit to all these people, including Georges Timigny, who nobody's heard of. But he's the equivalent on the French side as Dixon is on our side. And since I'm in the animation business, I just want to narrow down the movie business to the animation business and ask how many people here have ever heard of iWorks? Anybody? iWorks, guy on the right. That's Walt Disney and iWorks there. Who invented Mickey Mouse? iWorks. Who first animated him? iWorks. Who directed Steamboat Willie? iWorks. What was the name of the company in the first place? iWorks-Disney. Disney Company has just washed him out of their history. In fact, they wouldn't even let me publish this picture that you're looking at right now in my book because I call Disney a tyrant. And I didn't give him credit for inventing Mickey Mouse. So they says, okay, you can't get permission to publish that picture. So I said, but Pixar is worth several $1 billion to Disney. These attorneys weren't buying that logic, right? I guess I should just stop there and open it up. And let me just say one more thing really fast about these three guys. This is in the spirit of, geez, the histories just aren't written right. Even the ones that I thought I should know. Ivan Sutherland's the guy on the left, guy in the middle, Tim Johnson, and the guy on the right, Larry Roberts, all did computer graphics together at the same time. It wasn't just Ivan Sutherland. The guy in the middle, so Ivan Sutherland did Sketchpad, which was a two-dimensional program. Much to my surprise, I thought GR field comes from 3 dimensions, not 2. Who did Sketchpad 3 dimensions? The guy in the middle. At the same time, these guys were all office mates at MIT, all working at the same time. And the guy in the middle, Tim Johnson, did Sketchpad 3 with 3D, interactive 3D first, as far as I can tell. And it had perspective in it. The perspective solution was provided by Larry Roberts, the third classmate. I asked Larry before he died recently if he was offended that computer graphics world had never honored him. He says, Alvy, I'm so famous as the founder of the internet that I could care less what computer graphics is. Okay, the poor guy in the center, his curse is that he looks just like Ivan Sutherland. And he's alive still. And I went out to the internet, and you can do this to go out the internet, Google Images or something like that. I would settle on Sketchpad. Over 60%, the majority of the pictures that came back were of Tim Johnson Sketchpad 3, not Ivan Sutherland Sketchpad 2-dimensional version. So I'd like to give this guy credit. I call it the triumvirate, slight rewrite. Ivan's still a really important guy, don't get me wrong, but all right. And from that, believe it or not, Pixar follows, but I'm out of time.
Okay, do we have lots of questions? Let's go first. Shy.
Did anybody hear? If you don't have anything to say, I'll say something. There's this unspoken dogma, I call it the central dogma of computer graphics. I'm going to step over to, where is it? This picture, called 1984. To state the central dogma, as far as I know, it's never been stated out loud before, so we will make pictures based on 3-dimensional Euclidean geometry and Newtonian, modeled with Newtonian physics, and projected into 2 dimensions using Renaissance perspective. There's nothing about a computer that requires those 3 restrictions. That's why I call it a dogma. And yet every Pixar movie, in fact, every movie that's been made so far honors the central dogma. So I know I'm not talking to artists, but if there are any of you that do have artistic leanings, I say, please violate the central dogma and show us what else is out there. There's just nothing stopping us exploring the rest of the visual world. There's one scene in Soul which actually violates the central dogma, which are Soul. It's the pre-Soul location where the souls are before they get tied to the real world. The hidden surfaces aren't hidden. There's intersects are shown instead of actual hidden surfaces. So it's a violation of Newtonian physics, but that's the only place I can think of where the central dogma is violated. Used to people would scream out in an audience and say, "Is your goal, Alvy, to simulate reality?" And I went, "No, why do I keep getting asked that?" Because I came from an artistic background, and making pictures was what was important to me, not simulating reality. But to be honest, a lot of my colleagues, that is what they were out to do. And 1984, this picture right here was sort of the proof and concept that we were there in 1984. We got there. We had to tell people this was a fake picture because it's really good. And RenderMan was established at that point. Yes.
I quite catch what you said about the brain reconstructing getting information.
Well, that's where I wave my hands.
Yeah.
Because I have no idea what goes on in there. I just know that we're not doing a reconstruction from the film frames and then presenting it to the pupil of the eye. We just put the raw frames and the blanks, including the blanks in between, straight into the brain, and somehow it reconstructs the flow of pictures, right?
Mhm.
Now there are a lot of artifacts about the system that suggest it's doing resampling, like wheels that spin backwards. That's classic aliasing in motion. I spent a lot of time in my book, by the way, explaining that. Does it bother anybody, by the way, the wheels still spin backwards? Do you see it? Do you see it anymore? All the time, right? TV commercials, the wheels are always going the wrong speed and backward.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not sampling fast enough, right?
Right.
So that's exactly what you would expect if the system were doing a reconstruction from samples.
Mhm.
But and if you look at the response of some of the nerve cells in the retina, they have that shape. So there's kind of evidence that maybe the brain does a reconstruction before it turns it into a electrochemical signal and sends it on into the brain. But I don't know. I'm just waving my hands at that point.
Can you say a little more about this issue of Renaissance perspective and portraying or not portraying reality? Or do I have it right that it's just like in chemical photography, that it's just a coincidence that 25 mm lenses happen to subtend an angle that roughly corresponds to what our eyes see.
Yeah.
And if you hang it up on a wall at eye level height, oh gee, it almost matches. So that's just a coincidence. And then we got
We kind of selected it for the coincidence, I suspect, don't you?
no, well, I'm still.
I,
More people in your generation tend to say, well, seeing is believing, photographs capture reality. And when you
no,
point
well,
out that-
our artistic photographers blew that idea off a long time ago. Yeah.
But that's not the general public. The general public tends to think that pictures portray reality, whereas art is somehow an interpretation of it.
Point well taken. The dividing line is not nearly as stark as I've stated, is what you're saying, and I have to agree with that. This is the example I put up of a picture I drew in '72, I think, before I discovered computer graphics. I just used the rapidograph and French curve and ellipsoid templates and straight edges and stuff like that to draw this picture. But the reason I'm showing it is because this is not Renaissance perspective. You see the straight lines have to bend by 90 degrees from middle of the picture to the top of the picture. In fact, this is, in order to solve the perspective problem of this image, I went out to MC Escher and said, how did he solve that problem? And I came up with a solution imitating him. I'm particularly proud of this picture because it was used as the cover of the proceedings of the Foundations of Computer Science for 41 years. I think of it now as touching the metaverse.
I'm sorry, don't interrupt your.
No, I'm done.
So I was just thinking, you mentioned film and photographs, the old system with the, are those actually, so basically there are a whole bunch of dots on the film. Now, are those also?
Well, yeah, well, they're really tiny. They're pigment. Yeah.
They're pigments, they get really
Yeah.
small.
I mean, we approximate that as a continuum, but it's not really. If you get down to it, it's not. It's
So those are actually closer to pixels in a way.
Yeah, but they're not samples at all, right? They're just
It's how you perceive them. Yeah.
it's the molecules and how they videotape has got little ferrous particles glued to the surface of the tape. It's particles too, but they're really tiny.
Yeah, right. I understand.
Really nice picture, but what you show here, right? Like even now we have a really hard time capturing this, right? Take a panorama, look, right?
Yeah, I don't think you can get that with. There might be some lens on a camera that would give you that kind of.
A vertical panorama with their current iPhone
Would do it.
will look something similar to that.
Yeah.
So that's a question that I have. I wonder if there's also a generational difference that to me, a lot of panorama prints taken from smartphones using panoramas, they still look very strange. I'm wondering if people who have seen them since they were little.
It's ordinary. That's a good question. Yeah.
Panorama pictures don't look that strange to you guys. Or do they still?
This is like a panorama is not how we perceive the world, right? It looks different.
By the way, when I pursued this to the left and the right, it falls apart. I said, oh, Escher's really clever. He just captured the sliver through that distortion. That kind of makes some kind of sense. If you extend the rules to the left and right, it just falls apart. It's not pleasant to look at anymore. So it gave me an appreciation of Escher I didn't have. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious if you have any cool stories you want to finish Pixar and like.
Oh, I got hours of stories. So, the group now known as Pixar started on Long Island at a place called New York Institute of Technology. And we had 3 rich patrons along the way. The first one you never heard of, Alexander Schur. He, see if I can show you this. Oh, that's the New York Institute of Technology. It's this fabulous North Shore of Long Island, estates and mansions everywhere. And this wealthy man, that guy on the right, wanted to be the next Walt Disney. And a salesman talked him into the belief that a computer would improve the quality of old cell animation enough that he could make a lot of money using computers to make animated movies. And he was deluded, I think, but he was crazy in a good way as far as we were concerned, because he bought everything we asked for in order to make animated movies. For example, he bought us the first 24-bit pixels in the world. And these are some of the early artworks we did on them. Now, just to put that in perspective, the first frame buffer picture memory that he bought us, and I'm talking 500 by resolution, 512 by 512 nominally, $80,000.
8-bit, Steve.
$80,000. Okay. In mid-70s dollars. And he came to me one night and he said, "Hey, Alvy, are we the best computer graphics facility?" I said, "Yeah, we are." He said, how do we stay there? It's the right question to ask. How do we stay there? And I said, "Well, if you get us 2 more of these, I can gang them together and get 24 bits. And I tried to explain to him, not knowing whether he was understanding it at all, that, you know, it would be 256 colors improved to 16 million colors. And at 16 million colors, you can do anything. And I didn't know whether he got it or not. But several weeks later, he walked in, he says, "You know what? I bought you 5 more of those 8-bit thingies, so you'd have 2 of those 24-bit thingies." And we were out in front of the rest of the world starting right then. I mean, we just went nuts making art. Nobody has seen 24-bit stuff. Ed Catmull and I, the guy started Pixar with me, we invented the Alpha channel right then and there. Because suddenly we had enough memory to think about adding a 4th channel. Nobody had ever had enough memory to think like that. So to solve a particular problem, I just added another memory to it, and boom, we had the Alpha channel being used right here, for example, really early. George Lucas is our next patron. Steve Jobs is our 3rd patron. Just patron, by the way. They weren't. Steve Jobs is only money to us. That's all. Had nothing to do with it otherwise.
Did Lucas have any input or creativity? That
Well,
wanted?
he
Or did vision or-
no. But he grabbed it when he finally got the idea. As we spun out Pixar,
Uh-huh.
he finally got the idea. And his next 3 Star Wars movies just went crazy with CGI.
Mhm.
He finally got it, but he didn't have it
Okay.
before that. So, for example, when Lucasfilm hired us from New York Tech, you know, Ed and I jumped out thinking, "Oh boy, George is going to put us in his movies. Yay." The first Star Wars had already come out. And I started hiring the best guys in the world, just these geniuses right and left. Everybody wanted to come work with us because they wanted to be in the movies. Everybody wants to be in the movies. And then I sat there waiting for George to come by and ask us to be in the next Star Wars movie. He never came. All of a sudden I went, "Oh my God, he doesn't get it." I just assumed that he was hiring us to do content. He's hired us to do hardware and software development. He has this vision of bringing movie making into the modern high-tech world, and that's a great vision, and we're happy to help him do that. But we assumed that he wanted to do imagery as well. He never came until finally. So finally, what happened was Paramount Pictures showed up instead with Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, and wanted some of this newfangled computer graphics in their movie. They talked to Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects house at Lucasfilm. And those guys said, "Well, you know, we don't do that. We think the new guy's next door." That's what they do. They called me over. Long story short, I landed the project. I brought the team together. And I says, "Okay, we've got our shot at the big screen. Finally, this is it. This is the breakthrough moment. But what this is really, and we'll make everybody at Paramount and in the Star Trek II audience really happy. It'll make perfect sense narrative wise and so forth. But what this really is a 60-second shot, a commercial for George Lucas. So I don't know what the hell he's got. And I knew this secret about George, that he watches the camera. If you try to watch a movie tracking the camera, the director has failed because you haven't been sucked into the emotion. But George, I guess, could do both. He was always aware of the camera. I knew that somehow. And so I said, we're going to put a camera in here that'll blow his socks off. It won't be gratuitous computer graphics 101 while he's out. It'll make narrative sense. But he'll know that no real camera in the world could possibly have done this shot. And sure enough, we put this really elaborate shot, Star Trek II Genesis demo. Day after it was over, he's kind of a shy man. He stepped foot in my one foot in my office, and he said, "Great camera move." He was out of there. And he had us in sort of in the Return of the Jedi, just a little piece. But he told his buddy Steven Spielberg about us, and we were in Spielberg's next movie, and the word started spreading. Then they got divorced. George got divorced, and we had to scramble. And we spent 5 years as a hardware company. That's an awful 5 years.
What scene was it? Sorry.
What? It's called the Genesis demo. It's a moon-like planet. We fire a projectile at it from a spacecraft that's going by. Flame erupts into a flame that sweeps over the limb of the planet, melts its surface, and fractal mountains grow from the melted surface. As we pull away, the moon is turned to an Earth. Genesis demo.
That's one where Spock died.
Yeah. We didn't have anything to do with that.
How did this get done? You must know.
They're not Trekkies, they're Star Wars. Different generation.
I mean, the truth is, these things look kind of crude now. I go back and look at them, so I can, So one of the things I usually spend time on is Moore's Law. My version of Moore's Law is everything good about computers gets better by an order of magnitude every 5 years. That turns out to be mathematically equivalent to doubling of density of components on a transistor integrated circuit chip every 1.5 years, which is meaningless to me. It might mean something to you, but it's meaningless to me. But equivalent, anything good about computers, really high speed, really huge memory, really low cost, really small size. It's better by an order of magnitude, factor of 10, every 5 years. And every 5 years after that. It was 1 in 1965 when I made my first computer graphic picture. It's over 100 billion right now, factor. Computers are now 100 billion times better than they were in 1965. And it's headed for a trillion. It's right this very moment. I've surfed this wave my whole life. You have too, and will. I don't see there's any end in sight. People predict it's death all the time. But the engineers have to get there too. You have to get to the next order of magnitude before you can say, "Oh, I see how to go to the next order of magnitude." And they always do. Maybe they actually reach the end, but I've had the death's been prophesied too many times in my career for me to believe it. And as far as I can tell, what blows my personal mind, after watching this whole thing happen, is recently the Unreal Engine came out. And okay, so I should bring it down, right?
Two parts.
Okay. We at Lucasfilm in the 80s, we tried to estimate how big how many polygons are we going to need in a scene that satisfies an audience when we finally get there? And we came up with the number 80 million polygons per frame. And this, we were willing to wait 30 hours, 50 hours to get one frame. Unreal Engine does that resolution image in real time. I know that's what Moore's Law says is going to happen, but the reality of it just blows my mind. And, I just can't hold on to it. And that's what the law means. We puny human beings, we're no good after a factor of 10. We just can't intuit it. That's why we say order of magnitude. It's a really lofty term instead of factor of 10. You have to get to the next, you just have to let it unwind to see what's going to happen. Or another way to put it is if you're smart enough to see beyond an order of magnitude, you can probably be a billionaire. Maybe. I should stop. I can go on for a long time. I didn't really talk about it, but I got universal Turing machines here. Which are